Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Renata H. Delacqua, Christopher Schell, Mallory Stewart, and Gretchen Hund.
Great. Well, first off, so I'm Gretchen Hund, and I cannot thank all of you enough for coming, particularly given the competition we have of these other sessions that are going on at the same time. So I'm thrilled to see particularly people wandering in now. It's great. Come on in. We'd love to have all of you. This should be a really interesting session, and the title, as you can see, is Inputs versus Outputs. Would broadening who's heard change what's done? So we're going to dive into that, and I thought I'd just spend a minute and try to define nuclear policy, because it's an incredibly broad term, right? That means everything from non-proliferation to deterrence to arms control to disarmament to international diplomacy and alliances to legal and ethical issues to energy, environmental issues, and public health. Obviously, in 1 hour, we're not going to be able to hit on all of those topics, but we're going to do our best just to see where this conversation takes us and how these fabulous panelists, who I'm going to introduce next, are going to help weave that conversation. So really, it's very broad as far as what the term means. So as I said, we have three panelists, as you can see. To my left is Renata Delacqua, who's the head of the Gender and Disarmament Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, established in 1980 by the UN General Assembly with a mission to inform states and the global community on questions of international security and to assist with disarmament efforts so as to facilitate progress toward greater security and economic and social development. And to her left, we have Christopher Schell, who is a fellow in the American Statecraft Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focused on developing and advancing ideas for a more disciplined U.S. foreign policy aligned with American values and cognizant of the limits of American power in a more competitive world. Chris has worked extensively on race and U.S. foreign policy, specifically on the African American community's attitudes toward foreign policy. And finally, we have Mallory Stewart, who is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability, and was head of the Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance. So I'm going to start, as I said, I'm going to ask one question to each panel member, and they don't have that very long to answer this one question, and then we'll just kind of see where the conversation goes. And we're going to leave roughly 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A that I'm going to try to attempt to use off this iPad, see how well I do. Because we want to hear from you. So feel free to start, populating, if you will, whatever questions that you might have. So with that, let's just jump in. Renata, my first question, as I said, is for you. Given your research on gender and disarmament, it's given you an interesting lens to respond to the question that this panel is all about. And to drill down a bit, what perspective do women bring to the dialogue if they were better included, and how could their perspective benefit nuclear policy?
Thank you very much, Gretchen, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. When we think about bringing women's perspectives into nuclear policy making, there are a couple of things that may be in the background, but I think it's important that we address them up front. First, women are not a homogeneous group with a specific set of views. For sure, gender is one aspect that shape individuals' preferences and attitudes, but it's not the whole story. And secondly, women are not always, quote unquote, outsiders to nuclear policy making. At least they are not always outsider, not all the time, not everywhere. There are instances where women are very much present in nuclear policy making. Where I work at UNIDIR, we track women and men's participation across arms control and disarmament processes. And we've been looking at the NPT, and it's interesting to see the evolution of women's participation in the NPT. In 1980, for instance, women were 6% of the delegates at NPT meeting, and in 2024, women were 33% of the delegates. These numbers are averages. There may be delegations that have more than a third of women in their team, and there may be delegations that have less than a third or zero women in their team. A challenge that we see across the board refers to leadership roles. It's very rare to see women chairing a process on nuclear weapons, for instance. And why does this matter? You know, why should we care if an ambassador is a woman or a man? Do men and women think differently about nuclear weapons? This is a complex topic, and we should avoid stereotypes. But there are indications to suggest that women and men have different views on nuclear weapons. And that comes from a paper that we published in 2024. I have a hard copy here with me. It's a paper by Ellen Willio and Professor Michał Odenko. They looked at opinion polls covering 47 countries around the world, and they were able to see that, generally speaking, women tend to be more supportive of nuclear non-proliferation, and they tend to express more concern with the consequences of nuclear weapons use, even though that may vary, you know, from context to context, and gender, again, is not the whole story. There are other factors, for instance, if your country is at war or under attack. One thing that became clear in that study is that women tend to select the option "I don't know" more than men when asked what their views are on nuclear policy. And that does not necessarily mean that women are less knowledgeable, but it may indicate a willingness to learn and to admit that sometimes we simply don't know. In view of that, I would say, you know, what women bring to the table, I think a different perspective in a representative democracy that should matter, because all views should be represented in policymaking. So it's a matter of fairness, but it's also a matter of bringing fresh perspectives, of interrogating old paradigms, and avoid groupthink in nuclear policymaking.
Wow, very helpful. All right, Chris, I'm turning to you. Your polling on the African American community's attitudes towards foreign policy in general, and specifically security, have given you insights into how their views differ from the wider population. Please share with us an overview of those differences and how the dialogue would change if we included more African American, basically in the conversation and in developing actually nuclear policies.
No, of course. Thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here and to incorporate some of my insights into the nuclear policy space. As you stated earlier, Gretchen, primarily at Carnegie Endowment, a lot of my work is looking at the African American experience, African American thought tradition, how that has influenced and a lot of the tendencies are around questions around use of force and questions around security. And as you stated as well, you know, when we talk about different groups, racial, ethnic, gender, there's not like this one homogenous view. But I would put forth this argument, seeing one from the historical context, but also from polling, that there are certain tendencies that kind of arise out of, in this case, I would say, the African American experience in the United States. And in that regard, I will first start with saying that you see this particular tendency around trying to situate the question around nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, around questions around colonialism, decolonization, questions around trade-offs between using funding towards social programs or funding towards domestic issues as well. So you kind of see that from individuals who talk about gender. So a lot of people are familiar with Martin Luther King and his anti-nuclear activism, but in many ways he's pushed to do that because of his wife, Coretta Scott King. And because of her activism at Antioch College kind of influences his pushing Kennedy to go forth and try to ban nuclear testing. So that's like the historical context that we really see. But then really bringing it towards my current polling, what I found is that a question I kind of polled my pollster, this is back in November of 2023, is a question around what role would you like the U.S. to play in trying to stop the spread of nuclear weapons? And you have more than half, I think it was about 56% of a survey sample of about 1,000 African Americans saying that they would like to see the U.S. play a leading role in stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. Now, that number is fairly similar to other nationally representative polls by the Chicago Council. But one thing that you saw in my sample was that African Americans were less polarized than the white American population, or you could say American majority. There's a smaller numerical percentage difference. And some folks might say, well, that's because that's kind of driven by this issue of the political leanings of the African American community. A vast majority of African Americans are Democratic, so that might influence the data that you're seeing. And that may be true to a certain degree, but I would really bring it back to this historical tradition that I kind of pointed out earlier of seeing African Americans situate this question around nuclear weapons, and then, as you were saying earlier, nuclear energy, which is probably a whole other can of worms. But these questions around where nuclear reactors are being located, how the waste is being thrown away or how the waste is being preserved, how that's impacting African American communities. This larger question about funds towards nuclear weapons towards versus the social domestic program, so on and so forth. So in short, I would say that a lot of the contemporary polling that I've seen with African Americans and their thoughts on nuclear weapons is very much so informed by this, you could say, Cold War period thinking around nuclear weapons, how they're being used, how we're procuring the uranium, where the nuclear testing is happening. Much of it earlier phases happening in the Sahel, in the South Pacific, impacting nations of color. So that context kind of influencing what I will argue you see today, with a lot of the popular attitudes coming from the African American community.
Perfect, great. We're going to come back to that. Okay. Just wait. Okay, Mallory, for you, your experience in government has given you a front row seat in debating and developing these nuclear policies. And how have you seen policy conversations change when more perspectives are brought into the room? And what kind of new voices do you think could enhance the actual dialogue?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me to Carnegie and to be part of this panel. It's really wonderful. I have seen policy voices being added to conversations and being extracted from conversations. In the nuclear policy arena, you were exactly right. There's so many different angles. And what I've seen most recently, actually, which really was an evolution between my time in government under the Obama administration, under the Biden administration, was the enhanced, unfortunate siloing of some of the communities in the nuclear policy arena to the point where you now have purely deterrence conversations or purely non-proliferation conversations or arms control and risk reduction conversations that don't actually bring in the many different voices of the policy community that affect the ultimate risk reduction we're striving towards. And so, to sort of reverse your question a little bit, I think having seen the classic governmental stovepiping become even more, I think, harmful in an environment in which we're struggling with increased nuclear threats. We're struggling with sort of diminished maybe governmental resources being provided to limit the conversations to specific arenas in nuclear policy really shuts out important voices. And I can give specific examples. During my time in the Obama administration, also in the Arms Control Bureau at that time, there was a reserve seat for the Arms Control Bureau on the high-level group of the NATO Advisory Committee. The high-level group advises a nuclear planning group of NATO. There was a reserve seat for the Arms Control Bureau to provide sort of its insight and input into what is a DoD-led conversation. DoD chairs the HLG. Since the first Trump administration and continuing through the Biden administration, there was no longer that reserve seat. There was one State Department seat, and the regional representative from the State Department was the person in that seat. And I think not having some of that risk reduction expertise, or even the diplomacy that's geared toward the ADN community, the Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation community, lost some of the voices when NATO decision-making was advised from the HLG. So, the Russian narrative is always that they felt threatened by NATO, that justifies their aggressive maneuvers. And if you have a more deterrence-led conversation in the absence of the diplomats that are focused on trying to prevent some of the disinformation narratives about diplomacy, about sort of our efforts in NATO, you may forget that some of the messaging and comments from NATO can sound more aggressive, right? But if you have a risk reduction expert at the table, someone who is really focused exclusively on reducing the narratives that feed into strategic instability, you can hopefully prevent some of that messaging feeding into the Russian narrative. And that's just one example that hasn't actually gone back. In other words, there still is not a seat at the table that's reserved for the arms control expertise from the State Department. There's other examples throughout the government, and I can talk about that really have changed in the last several decades from a more unified nuclear policy arena where you had deterrence expertise and risk reduction, arms control, non-proliferation sitting together. One of the reasons that I changed the name of the bureau at the State Department where I worked from arms control verification and compliance, which is arms control 3 ways, to arms control deterrence and stability is because you can't really distinguish sometimes between the deterrence effects of an arms control treaty, right? We will attribute your violation to you and we will hold you accountable. We will deter you from violating. Or normative deterrence that the Arms Control Bureau focuses on in the emerging tech space, such as preventing direct assent destructive anti-satellite testing through the UN First Committee, or reinforcing, strengthening the Outer Space Treaty, especially Article 4, prevention of a nuclear weapon placement in orbit. So these are all both arms control, but also deterrence. And we do ourselves a disservice when we eliminate some of those voices from the collective conversation of risk reduction. And yet, even though we recognize this, I've seen further enhanced stovepiping between those communities. If you just look at the number of conferences that say this is a deterrence conference, or this is an arms control conference, or a non-proliferation conference, and you can have specialized conferences. But really, here at Carnegie, in this specific conference, trying to bring together those players is one of the elements, one of the values. And it is unfortunate that we don't have much representation of the Defense Department here or Strategic Command, who should also be adamantly interested in the conversation of nuclear policy that's happening, but that's just an example. So hopefully that answered your question.
No, that's great. And it's funny because it really does dovetail from the conversation that was just before us. If you happen to go to that session, talking about multidisciplinary need and having these different voices, and we want to get out of these, excuse the pun, silos that came up at lunch today, and someone said silos. Oh, I shouldn't really use that word. I thought it was pretty appropriate.
They're just windmills. It's okay. No.
All right. So I'm going to kind of shift gears, but we're going to come back to all of these issues. But I thought it'd be interesting to basically look to Renata to find out more about the barriers that particularly women have had in trying to break in and get into this field. And how could you envision kind of tearing down those barriers, if you will? Like, you're queen for a day. What would you do in order to try to get those barriers out of the way?
Okay, as a researcher, I will talk about the research findings.
I know.
So we asked diplomats, when we did this research where we looked at the proportion of women and men participating in NPT meetings, we asked diplomats, help us put this in context. Numbers don't tell the whole story, what's behind it? And different topics came up. And I think I would tell you, all barriers, they are social. They're not physical barriers. It's nothing to do with a woman's height or strength or any of this. But it varies region from region because these are social issues. But there were common themes that came up from the diplomats. A lot of them were about how this field has rewarded characteristics that have been more commonly associated with men. So the idea of who is a good diplomat in security affairs, tends to emphasize the traits that have traditionally been associated with men. For instance, quote unquote, seriousness, toughness, risk-taking, and military background. And military background, I mean, it is something, around the world, women are the minority in the military, so that's one aspect. A lot of that, it becomes, that the association between masculinities and expertise. This is something that we see in this field, but also in other fields related to security, where a woman make a contribution and it's perceived as, quote unquote, non-technical. So these were things that the diplomats were telling us. There were also issues related to family life, how sometimes, each place is differently, but generally women tend to shoulder more of the care work at home. And in the diplomatic life, the career is very demanding, both for men and women. Men also said that it takes a toll on their personal life, having to travel so much and be away from family as well. So there is a scope there, I think, for adjusting diplomatic practice to allow for a better work-life balance. And that would be something that would benefit not only women, would benefit everyone. And I think, again, this association, we still see this association between gender and prestige, where the most prestigious jobs are still held by men. And this is something that will take time to change. When doing this research, I came across this expression called the law of increasing disproportion. So the higher you go in, like power ladder, the lower percentage of women you will see. And that goes, if you look at the pictures of foreign ministers in the world or heads of states and so on and so forth. But thinking about our own field, I was trying to do this, and I would like to ask your help afterwards as well. How many women have chaired the NPT, PrepCon, or RevCon? I couldn't find like a complete record of that. But what I've seen is that there have been around 45, 46 something meetings of the NPT, PrepCon, and RevCon, and I think like 45 men and 2 women chairing. Wow. So still, if we think we have made a lot of progress, and we have done, there's still a long way to go to ensure that women and men have the same opportunities to shape outcomes in this field.
You know who I wish we could beam into this room right now is Rose Gottmuller, right?
Yeah.
I happen to know her. I think a lot of us do. And I mean, talk about somebody who's kind of, I don't know if she's figured it out, but she sure has been an incredible, as far as a role model, to think about someone who has balanced family life. I mean, I thought it was great. I have a family commitment. I can't leave, California, and I can't be with you today. So anyway, just as an aside, just thinking about it. But I also personally just think when you get women's heads together, and no offense, Chris, I don't know, somehow we're often very solutions-based. We're trying to look for ways to, make this a better planet. And we're not so, I want to sound smarter than you. I don't know. It's just my 2 cents for whatever it's worth. Chris, I'm going to turn to you for a question. We may have hoped and had aspirations that Congress would take the lead in addressing the risks of nuclear weapons being used, but that's not going to happen. I just think the time may be for civil society. It's going to have to jump in. And obviously, civil society was really active back in the 80s. I think it's probably been used several times, but we had the march in Central Park. We had the movie The Day After, and so there was this great movement, if you will, back then. And I just am wondering, what can we do to reignite? I mean, this is the big we, right? Yeah. Civil society to kind of care about this issue again and jump in. If you have any ideas. Yeah. And obviously, I'd love to hear from anyone else as well. I'm just picking on Chris.
No, of course. No, I'm happy that you asked that question, because I've written quite a bit about civil society, primarily with the Israel-Gaza situation, but we're not here talking about that. We're talking about nuclear policy. But on that note, I can't help but to think about how on one civil society organization that comes to mind, one of the oldest, if not leading civil society orgs, NAACP, for those who may not know, National Advancement for the Association of Colored People. Almost kind of forgot that for a minute. And just thinking about how, obviously we know that their main issue was U.S. civil rights. But when you had individuals, I'm thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, who were in the ranks, they brought the nuclear question to the front of the NAACP's agenda. And what I think is quite interesting, and I think just follow me here, I'm gonna bring it all the way back around, but the NAACP under the leadership of Walter White kind of moves away from the question of nuclear disarmament, ban the bomb, in many ways because of the 1950s McCarthy era, this belief that a lot of these individuals who are a part of the anti-war, pro-peace, anti-nuclear proliferation movement are communists, like the bad C word. Mm-hmm. And because you end up having that, you have the NAACP kind of going back to what you're saying about silos, or someone said silos and windmills, NAACP quickly saying, no, we're going to back away from this issue of nuclear policy because of the intellectual bent that these individuals who happen to be African American kind of have on the nuclear policy issue. And I will argue that has kind of stayed with us till this day, where on many foreign policy issues, because of that fear back in the 1950s of being labeled communist, being labeled un-American, moving away from certain issues and kind of staying with the safe, voting rights, the safe civil rights issue. I don't know how safe civil rights are, but the conventionally safe civil rights issues, and not kind of linking and seeing nuclear policy and domestic well-being as intricately linked together. So I say all that to say to this day, using the NAACP issue, you kind of see contemporarily where they're coming around. I think there have been several resolutions, one in 2014, one in 2018, resolutions around nuclear energy. I know that's a whole other can of worms of nuclear energy and kind of the resurgence of nuclear energy, but it's kind of being fueled by this early, like I said earlier, 1960s, 70s concern about nuclear energy and nuclear waste. So to answer your question, I think that civil society, I'm thinking primarily NAACP, and there's numerous other organizations, have a role in essentially advancing, we're talking about diverse voices, as it were in the 1940s, how NAACP kind of provided at one point a space for civil rights leaders to speak out on nuclear policy issues. But unfortunately, I'm thinking about today, where you kind of have this shrinking civic space to talk about certain issues. It may not be necessarily about nuclear policy issues, it might be other foreign policy issues, but I am concerned today where that civil society, obviously the answer is yes, civil society has a role in essentially advancing, we could say, alternative, diverse voices that may not fit the status quo, but I am concerned where we think about how alternative voices may be deemed un-American like we had in the 1950s. And the solution, I know we're trying to be solution oriented. Maybe this is my male brain I don't know if I'm gonna find a solution, but if trying to think through a solution is that civil society does play a critical role in trying to, I guess, shield some of the leading internationalist minds, some of the minds who are saying that the issue of, let's just say, domestic well-being cannot be separated from the issue of nuclear policy. So I think in short, it kind of comes down to civil society orgs, putting the NAACP on the spot, not backing away from certain issues as they had in the 1940s, 1950s. And that in many ways could shield voices who may not kind of fit the status quo thinking on, in this case, nuclear policy, and backing away, just kind of, silencing themselves.
Great. I'm going to, because I think this is an important issue, so I'm going to lean on the two of you if you'd like to jump in. Just again, what encouragement, what can we do to try and pull, civil society into this more?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really inspired by some of the comments made about the history of moving away from issues or toward issues, and I think it seems like in the policy arena, we've put ourselves into individual camps. We have to identify ourselves as, I'm defense and deterrence, or I'm an arms controller and a risk reducer or a non-proliferation advocate. I don't understand why we have to divide ourselves that way, right? I would like it to come back to national security expert, right? Risk reduction writ large. And I think bringing in additional elements of society. So this would be an environmentalist that has really pushed forward some of the nuclear energy conversations. Insurance companies, we've brought so many of the commercial players into the emerging technology arena with our defense and deterrence sort of communities. But the insurance companies have also been advocates for rules-based approaches to controlling some of the more risky behaviors of those emerging technologies or the more risky uses. And so relying on economic factors even to guide us into greater national security by trying to minimize risky behaviors, right? That was our efforts with respect to, again, prohibiting the intentional creation of debris through ASAT testing, and our efforts to lead to political declaration on the responsible use of AI by the military was in part fed by commercial industry, by insurance companies wanting to protect investments, wanting to understand how you can have longevity in the space arena for that technology that you place up there. And I think bringing in the economics will really bring together some of these camps that have divided themselves for no real good reason, except that expertise does does sort of feel, I think, more comfortable with equivalent backgrounds, and the echo chambers that we all love in our social media platforms also plays out in a policy arena. So trying to overcome those echo chambers and those natural proclivities for finding those that have your same belief structure by bringing in new players, such as the environmental world, the economic and insurance company world, bringing in, as you suggested, new voices from a psychiatry perspective to analyze some of the deterrence theories that we have that have never really been tested, trying to bring in new players to really push us outside of our camps and bring us together to say, okay, let's think about this all collectively.
Great.
Yeah, if I may add.
Yes, please.
Gretchen, I've been thinking while my colleagues were speaking, what are good examples of when civil society mobilized in issues related to arms control and disarmament. And I think, these have been moments where it was really clear for them why it matters. So I think like having a narrative, why should we care? Why should you care about it? I feel like a people-centered approach tends to, be more encouraging if you know what's at stake for the individuals, for the communities in specific places. So I think that's on us to be able to communicate this, to connect with issues. And I think like what mobilizes people, I don't know, issues of justice, of fairness, humanitarian concerns. I think this is part of our work as well, to highlight how nuclear security connects with that. And also to develop like a positive narrative as well, because I don't know if you've heard of this, Chris. Once I heard someone say, like, Dr. Martin Luther King connected people by saying, I have a dream, not by saying I have a nightmare. So it's like,
Oh, that's interesting.
being able to convey, like what it is that you're working towards in a positive framing could be something, that brings people together more than the doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Really interesting. I'm thinking about the first session this morning that I was here at 7:30 for, which was focused on better storytelling.
Yeah.
And I think that is central to what we're now talking about is how have we, kind of missed the boat, if you will, with respect to telling the story so that it is encouraging and it is more of a dream. And I also like this concept of we don't have to get there tomorrow. There are all these incremental steps that can help us get along the way. And if we can figure that out and map that out, then at least we feel like we're making some kind of progress.
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood has a role in all of this, right? The messaging, the media, Oppenheimer, the movie, I think did more to raise awareness of this issue than many other sort of less big budget productions could have done. And I think that's something that also has to be utilized to bring folks together, I think, in understanding that we have a common imperative for global stability and not just sort of like more weapons, more arms racing, or more treaties and more rules of responsible behavior, but we actually have to figure out how to do it in a way that makes sense, that minimizes risk across the board.
Well, that's great. Okay, so fast forwarding to today, we have a nuclear modernization plan that's going to cost the U.S. trillions over decades. How could you envision broadening the audience who tracks and cares about this issue? And here I'm thinking again about all the different voices. But even, I mean, obviously it's U.S. modernization, but I'm thinking about foreign voices. We haven't really talked about their role. Religious leaders, who look at this as a morality issue, given the Pope just passed away. But so I'm feeding I don't want to, those are just some ideas I threw out, but I'd love to hear your ideas about specifically that, because that did come out this morning during the session, which is a lot of people can resonate with this, whoa, we're spending that much money on this? And, thinking about other ways, I mean, it is a negative, but thinking about, well, how could that money be spent instead? So any of you would like to take that on, I'm happy to hear what your thoughts are. All right, they're all now going to be quiet.
I do have initial thoughts. I was trying to go second, but I'll go first. Well, I mean, I think you kind of already touched on it to a certain degree. It was a feature in somewhat of a negative light in our past recent election. But yeah, like I was saying earlier, the guns and butter trade-off. There's this question about, I guess you could say, defense spending versus spending for domestic social programs. I think going back to what you were saying when it comes to narrative, what narrative are we telling? I think that also feeds into this general narrative that we saw definitely put in play in November of 2024, but even like a narrative that was even used before that. I'm even thinking about Jesse Jackson when he ran in '84, and some political scientists will argue that he in many ways revitalized the Democratic Party, where some of the narrative that he was kind of telling around money for, I think he said, money for food and not for bombs. But yeah, so I use that as a historical example of how we think about, I guess, political campaigning and the success of certain parties trying to be nonpartisan here, going back to a certain narrative that Americans kind of think about when it comes to like kitchen table issues. So I think if you frame it in that light, which we've seen it done historically, it's less nebulous for American people. I think, yes, the movie Oppenheimer, that's pop culture. It's right in people's living rooms or it's in the movie theater. When we start talking about some other aspects of nuclear policy, it might seem a bit distant, nebulous, large, multi-syllable words, and oh, yeah, I'm just checking out. But when you kind of just reduce it down to this question of just guns and butter trade-offs, might be a bit reductive, but I think in that way you can kind of broaden it to audiences that are not in the nuclear policy priesthood.
Great point. Anybody else?
Just to highlight what Rose Gottemuller had just pre-recorded in her acceptance speech, which was, we have an opportunity now with a president who has said he wants to denuclearize, whatever that means to him. He wants to save the money. He doesn't want to spend this excessive number that we can't even visualize going forward. And so understanding how to make that sort of a less politicized statement, make it bipartisan in a way by substantively analyzing the decisions that had gone into that modernization. And I am not anti-modernization at all. I just think we need to sort of evaluate where it's necessary, where it's done for political purposes, where we've decided we can control nuclear escalation through some sort of new weapons program, and why we've made that decision. And I think so trying to pull it out of a political angle and put it into a real question and discussion that has all parties to the conversation.
And Gretchen, at the multilateral level, the UN Secretary General has called on states to decrease military spending. So this has been something, that he's voiced his concern about the growth of military spending worldwide. This call has been present in different places, but one area, that has a lot of interconnection with this is Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Mm-hmm. It has been part of, renewing commitments towards Women, Peace and Security Agenda to call on states to decrease military spending. And with the Pact for the Future also, there is a call there and a mandate for the UN to do a study on the impact of military spending on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Oh, really?
So this is something that will come out by the next meeting of the General Assembly, so around September, October this year. And I hope it will be a chance to highlight these trade-offs between, some development goals that have already been agreed, and with the progress or lack of progress on that front, and military spending on the other hand.
Perfect. This is a great segue to my next question. But then we're going to come back to something you just brought up, Mallory. Some people have suggested trying to broaden the tent of nuclear policy and, basically trying to decrease the risk of these weapons getting used to include kind of intersectionality issues, if you will, looking at kind of sustainable development, what you just mentioned. So that's really interesting that they're looking at that. So kind of climate change, social justice, there are these different issues that people think of that kind of can intersect, and all of a sudden, instead of just caring about weapons, now we're thinking a little bit more broadly, because these kind of issues do kind of come together. So I'd love to hear anybody's ideas about what approaches you'd recommend to do that job, to bring those kind of communities together so that we can increase kind of awareness, if you will.
It was something that we worked on a little bit and we discussed a little bit in the international community in the last 4 years, which was escalation spirals are not going to be purely military, right? You can see resource constraints leading to challenges between governments, between individual groups of people. You can see environmental constraints and really life or death decisions over access to water or access to food or sort of movement pathways, migration pathways. All of these can lead to escalation that becomes military. So why wouldn't, in talking about risk reduction, why wouldn't you bring in all of the factors to the conversation to try to minimize the drivers of that instability, right? So looking to beyond the military arena, beyond sort of even the traditional national security diplomacy discussions, looking to environmental debates, looking to scientific communities, as many in the national labs have already been looking to have scientists talk to scientists about the threats that they see, setting aside weapons that the world could be facing together. And so those would be good conversations to continue to understand escalation spirals that ultimately lead to arms racing.
Wow, that's really helpful. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I can give an example from Geneva, where I work. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has been working on issues related to the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. That's a very specific issue, but they've been looking at that at the request of the Marshall Islands. They've been having like technical visits to Marshall Islands and to apply a transitional justice approach to the issue of the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. And it's interesting because, to be honest, that conversation is happening completely separately from all the discussions we have on nuclear issues. And to the degree that I don't even know, if countries who are active both in the NPT and in the Human Rights Council, if they, their delegations, the disarmament delegation and the human rights delegation are talking about it. But yeah, so there was a way to look at how nuclear treaties can contribute to transitional justice. And for instance, in that specific report of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, they talk about the NPT as an instrument to prevent nuclear legacies. The CTBT, again, non-reoccurrence is also an issue of transitional justice. So it's a way of like reframing the conversations we're having here in a different kind of framework that connects with human rights defenders on the ground and maybe of relevance to people working on the Marshall Islands, but also in other areas that have been impacted by nuclear weapons tests.
Well, it's interesting. Gosh, this is going to be so fun. I really thought we were going to have, I know I have to get to the questions from your audience, but I have two more. And one stems from what you just said, and then we're going to go back to something Mallory said earlier, and that is so many people think of deterrence as this necessary thing that I have to have these weapons. But they often don't tie deterrence into thinking about, well, what happened in order to develop those weapons? I mean, obviously testing, Marshallese, all these people being hurt. What about uranium mining? And now we've exposed all these people. We have, the downwinders, and so we've got, these different statutes to try and compensate for those people that have gone through these harms. And so trying to think about what those human harms, because that is a cost, has meant, and how that really affects or ties into deterrent. So anyway, if anybody would like to comment on that. But it was very interesting because one of my questions, and you just nailed it.
I think in that specific report, again, very specific to the case of the Marshall Islands, they also talk about truth seeking, and how people affected by the whole production of nuclear weapons, they really feel that information gaps about what happened to them and what are the impacts on their health.
Wow, that's great.
It's something that they would really like to see more research and more information available on it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that could be encouraged: more research, more open research. Declassifying certain documents and so on.
So this question I have that I keep referring to is, and this is really important to me, is thinking about approaches to bring in people who have historically been really skeptical of diversity efforts. And I'm just going to be blunt. So at Plowshares, because I can be, we once a year pretty much host a meeting in DC where we bring in all these different congressional reps, senators, congressmen, and discuss these issues. And to a person, we hear, God, I really do care about this issue, but my constituents, this is just not something they wake up in the morning and they're, making my phone ring off the hook. And typically, it's all been Democrats. And that's driven me crazy, because this should be bipartisan and if not nonpartisan. Don't all of us in the world really not want to have nuclear weapons go off in our backyards? I mean, I think the answer is yes. And so I'm really curious in what ideas you have for how do we bring in those skeptics to make this kind of safe for them. Because part of the problem is, let's be honest, people right now are kind of worried about sticking their head up and saying, oh, I'd like to be heard, because they don't want to get on the wrong side of whatever. And I can let you connect those dots. So, but I'd love to hear your ideas about how can we, because I think about, the non-Luger, right, back in time. How do we get the Lugers of today to care about this?
I mean, one of the things that I think we struggle with is the diminishment of education about the value of risk reduction initiatives in military training. I'm not sure, and anyone can correct me, if it's a mandatory part of our military academies. They learn about, all the defensive movements, the war training, the war gaming, the missile work, but you don't necessarily learn about the history of how arms control and nonproliferation have reduced risk and have been successful in certain arenas as a mandatory class. You can choose it, I believe, but it's not across the board in our academia for training our military professionals. It also has been overly politicized. So the idea that you're somehow this tree-loving, peacenik, if you say, I just want to analyze whether all these nuclear weapons are absolutely necessary, right, should be taken off the table, and you should be able to ask these questions in a non-politicized environment. But, the challenge is it's either not in the popular culture's sort of training or understanding or approach to the world because it hasn't been sort of taught about or discussed openly, or it's become overly politicized. So if you raise your hand and identify as someone who cares about nuclear risk, you will be slotted into a team, and that team is a very politicized arena. And so if we can try to educate everyone more broadly, have this be an element of military training, have it be an element of our historical training. And I think it is, in school we learn about World War II, we learn about the conversations, but we don't actually talk about sort of Cold War mechanisms necessarily as much as we should, unless you get to graduate level work. And maybe it's just something that we need to start educating ourselves more on and trying to depoliticize.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Mallory, because we at Plowshares have two very, very hardcore defense people on the board, which I love. And my statement is always, we're not anti-defense, we're anti-nukes. And so talking to the younger, I've often said, if we could get to the Army War of College and talk to people about how this can be very destabilizing as in nuclear weapons, and just to understand the ins and outs of that. So it is a safe place to have that discussion. I think it's a really important point. All right, sorry I talked too much. Others?
I'm going back to the pop culture reference. I'm thinking about the power that Oppenheimer played. Something else I'm thinking about, even for like the younger generation, and maybe there's already an initiative I'm not aware of, but video games. I'm just thinking about myself coming of age playing Call of Duty and all the other video games, the list can go on and on. Thinking about, is there some way in which you can, I don't know if this is the right terminology, incorporate more nuclear lingo, nuclear references, so on and so forth, in kind of going back to the gender conversation, in those games, trying to raise some type of awareness about the nefarious aspects of nuclear weapons, so on and so forth. So I do think there's a major power in pop culture in trying to kind of capture shortening attention spans amongst the younger generation, including myself, and just trying to do something there where it's trying to kind of meet people where they are.
Yeah.
You mentioned going to the war college, like meet folks where they are. And I think one way is pop culture, movies, and then another aspect of video games.
Oh, it's great. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I want to just, see this through a different side, how can we make the policy-making process more inclusive? Because you get all these people interested, and at the end of the day, there are debates whether or not civil society should be in the room in the UN. So it's like there is also a role for each state to also make sure they are creating opportunities for these people who become interested in nuclear policy issues to have their voice heard at national level, regional level, and multilateral level as well.
Really great. Oh, this is fun. Okay, Jackson DuPont is asking, how can bringing in non-nuclear expertise broaden the tent of the nuclear security field, and at the same time, how can nuclear security experts be ambassadors to an increasingly existential world? We've kind of hit on that, but would anybody would like to dive into that one more than what we've already covered?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I mean, it's a really good question. We often talk about risk reduction in other arenas beyond the nuclear field, and I think reducing risk is something that humans inherently understand, but maybe you can learn the lessons that of successes in the nuclear risk arena, bring it into other arenas, right? The idea that we have an intractable challenge in political objectives between the U.S. and the USSR, and we were able, even in the face of missiles pointed at each other, to find something of common interest. Bringing that risk reduction analysis, what helped, what hurt, was it the arms racing? Was it the economic drain? Just learning more from that and applying it to other fields. And we've done it in the sort of weapons space, right? We've brought the toolkit of nuclear risk reduction into a CBRN arena, into reducing risk in chem bio, but can we bring it into other arenas, right? That would be a question, I think, in answer to Jackson's point. But I also think bringing in, as we mentioned in the beginning, the economics, the insurance companies, the commercial investors that say, here, I've invested in this satellite, how do I keep this satellite safe? Well, you sign up with a company that's taking responsible behaviors, you actually encourage regulation so that you know how your satellite will operate, or you know how your satellite will interact with other operators in a safe way, and thus your investment is protected. So bringing in the economic motivating factors and the players in that arena.
Great. This is a question from Allie Maloney for Christopher. What were the gendered breakdowns in your polls, noting how intersectional identities may impact policy opinions?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So for the top line in the poll that came out in 2023, I didn't do a gender breakdown, but I know that Pew Research actually has a breakdown on gender when it comes to questions around what role the U.S. should play when it comes to stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. If I remember correctly, 70% of women were in favor of the U.S. playing a leading role versus 44% of men. So going back to the earlier comment about the gender differences, there definitely is a gender breakdown. I know from it's not a part of the top line if anyone's looking to see the research. I don't have it along the lines of race, but from a lot of the other research I've conducted when it comes to African Americans and favoring different strategies that kind of lead for more diplomacy instead of armed conflict, there definitely is a higher likelihood of African American women seeking a form of diplomacy over a war.
Great. Terrific. This is a question from Lillian Malden for Renata and Chris. From your research, what gaps do you see between our academic policy community and grassroots nuclear activists? How can civil society organizations collaborate with grassroots organizations and individuals negatively affected by nuclear testing? Again, we've kind of hit, some of these questions obviously came in before we got into Marshallese. But anyway, any other additional comments or?
Yeah, I would say the gaps, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say from my own vantage point, I think going back to my earlier conversation about the NAACP, I think in recent decades, they've actually done a really good job of working with civil society organizations. I'm thinking about the community in Burke County, Georgia, the NAACP making sure to have several resolutions kind of raising concern about nuclear weapons, but kind of working with, trying to think of the names, We Act, several other grassroots African-American orgs who are kind of seeing the intersection of climate justice and we could say environmental justice and nuclear weapons. So I'm sure there are gaps, but what I've actually seen is kind of a reversal of the distancing of civil society orgs and you could say more grassroots, for lack of better words, quote unquote, radical organizations. I think that you've kind of seen a reverse and kind of making up for what happened in the mid-20th century.
From where I sit, looking at issues related to gender, arms control, and disarmament, I have the impression that academia is more advanced. They bring up these topics, they have been looking at these topics earlier than states, for a longer time than states. And it is a process, it takes time, for ideas and concepts and research developed in the academia to trickle down to policy. But I would encourage, all the scholars here, you make a difference. Because, with the data and the facts and the numbers, it makes easier to argue the case. And even if it takes time, I see it happening. So I think the gap is more, is that, states and policymakers in general, they need a bit of a push. And people in academia are already a bit ahead in terms of looking at the issues. I'm sure climate change and other areas is the same. So it's important also to be able to translate the academic findings into, a two-pager, something, that the policymakers can easily grasp.
Here.
An infographic, a couple of bullet points where you have the data and the number. I'm sure the research still needs to be lengthy and it still needs to engage with the theory and all of that. But if you are able to translate that into a few actionable points, I think, I think that's the hardest part, but I think it makes a difference.
Most important.
Yeah,
really important. All right, this question isn't for anyone specifically, it says, but Alistair Ian Johnson has written about the tendency of states to refer to adversaries in animalistic terms, making them not human, and exasperating the us versus them relationship. How can the introduction of diverse voices to the national security conversation help facilitate more appropriate perceptions of adversaries? Boy, that's a mouthful. Anyone would like to try to tackle that one?
I mean, I do think we overly define our adversaries as, not necessarily equivalent to us in any way, and I think it's ridiculous. And bringing in different backgrounds, different heritage, right? It means that you may bring in people that have historical ties to that other country, and showing that we're all human, we all have the same instincts, we all have the same fears many times, can help overcome some of those fundamental assumptions. And I think, a lot of the point of engagement, even if you don't successfully negotiate something every single engagement, is just realizing that the person across the table from you has similar concerns about your behavior as you have about theirs. And I think, realizing that there could be some, realizing that the diverse backgrounds that sit on the table on our side could help us better understand that those on the other side also have the human qualities that we share. I mean, it seems like a very obvious thing, and yet somehow we're very much comfortable not engaging because we feel that if we engage somehow, we'll be somehow placed at risk or somehow weaker in that engagement. I never understood that argument, but I do think that the underlying assumptions in risk reduction and arms control is that engagement will help you even if you can't conclude something at the table, because it will help you understand the other side, understand their arguments, their motivations, and what they're concerned about.
Great. Question from Tom Coppin. Is there anything that can be done to better reach stakeholders in nuclear weapon states, such as Russia or China? Really good question.
I'll jump in only if you guys won't. I think it's an absolute thing we must do. The TPNW crew, the effort to push a nuclear ban treaty has been very effective in talking to civil society in those countries such as the P3, the US, the UK, and France, that have active civil society. So we feel a lot of sort of push from that community, and yet Russia and China do not feel equivalent pressure. And I just think it's not realistic to think that the US will disarm in the absence of Russia and China taking steps in the same direction, because it would be political suicide, it would be actual physical potential suicide, and it would lose sort of our allies and partners' sense of security. So the less they push on Russia and China, the less likely it is that we'll be able to move forward towards disarmament as a whole.
I mean, I don't have any specific insight, but I feel like history has shown that links between academics have been very, very good to overcome conflicts in the past. And I'm from Brazil, I'm thinking about Brazil and Argentina that had, complicated relations related to nuclear issues as well, and mistrust, and, the fact that you had a network of academics working together, even when the countries were at odds with each other. That was very helpful. So I can think of academic exchanges, track 2 meetings, and, insisting on dialogue.
Great. Terrific. I have 39 seconds left. My last question is, what recommendations do you have for young women and young professionals of other minority groups in the nuclear field? Very wide open, which is kind of how we started, but anybody like to tackle that one? Keep at it. No, sorry, go ahead. Don't give up. All right, I think we're done. Are we done?
No.
Come on.
No. Let's think together.
8 seconds. No, we're good.
No, I think this field is complicated in terms of the issues that we need to tackle, but it's such it's so rewarding once you have this community and the kindness and the relationships you build. So focus on doing the work and the research, but also making friends.
I think it's a great note to end.
I think that would be my
Well, you
advice.
obviously have the enthusiasm. We can all feel it, and this is your field. So
I will say this. I'm pretty much an outsider. I'm not a nuclear expert, but I will say this in regards to kind of flipping the question. I think for those who are within the nuclear policy priesthood, kind of making allies, like kind of essentially extending out the olive branch. So from my standpoint, there are folks, going back to the question, who are women or who are racial minorities who are trying to get into the field. But I think the onus is also on folks who are also within the space to be open to individuals who maybe have not even just diversity, even of just like immutable characteristics such as race and gender, but just ideology.
Yeah.
I'm kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about kind of being committing career suicide for kind of voicing ideas that may not be kind of held by Washington. So anyway, so in short, folks who are willing to say, hey, I'm going to kind of create space for somebody who may not kind of fit the normative mold.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think it's the fact that this community of young people with different perspectives, different backgrounds can ask different questions than have traditionally been asked in a field that has stayed very static. We have intractable problems that have been solved for decades, and we need new voices, new questions, coming from outsider perspectives, coming from the perception of folks that haven't been sort of born and raised in a nuclear policy arena to actually make us think and re-question and reevaluate our assumptions. I think that's crucial, and everyone should pursue it.
can everyone help me thanking them for their input? Thank you very much. I think we only have one more big session to go, and we've made it to the end. So well done, everyone.
Thank you, Gretchen.